Hello, Yavs. In our Bible study this week, we'll be focusing in on chapter 25 of Matthew's Gospel, which is made up of three different stories. Verses 1 through 13 and 14 through 30 are two parables, and that's the part we'll be focusing on this week. Then verses 31 through 46, which we'll dig into next week, give us a saying of Jesus in the form of a story about the final judgment of all people. So to talk about Matthew 25 is really to talk about stories. And we who work in world mission depend on stories to help teach and bring awareness about the places in which we serve. Through stories, we share about different cultures, about how pressing issues create real struggles for the people that we accompany in our ministry. And we also witness and retell the stories of our partners and friends who experience hardships and often have an intense, even intimate relationship with God. We tell stories about their creativity and their resilience, their hopes, and all of the many experiences that we share. When someone shares their story with us, we become responsible for that story and for ensuring that we only share it if it matches their desire, the desire of the person who shared it with us. And we only share it in ways that honor their wishes, integrity, and agency. Last week, I invited you to reflect on the role stories have played in your life and would ask you to revisit that topic now. Who has told you stories in your life? When have you told stories? Do you seek out stories these days? Maybe in books or movies, listening to the stories of people in your family, your friends, people that you meet by circumstance. I also wonder if you think there are times when storytelling does harm. That's an important element for us to keep in mind because I think there are lots of ways that telling stories can actually do harm or have unintended consequences. I'm thinking about gossip, for example, or plagiarism, or if we're somehow involved in the story ourselves, but it's somebody else's story, maybe we think that telling it will make us look good, will bring us fame or praise. So there are lots of ways I think that storytelling can get complicated. You may think of others. We can also go astray if we're not careful as listeners of a story, if we aren't careful about how we engage with the stories that we hear. Because if we don't understand the story's context, we may misunderstand the whole point of the story. This is certainly true in the Bible. So if you read the essay by Walter Wink last week about Matthew 5, that's a great example of just how much we can confuse the message if we don't do the work of learning about the context. Jesus doesn't explain all of those details because his advice came at a time and in a place where it was tailored to fit perfectly into the reality that his audience was already living and familiar with. If we assume that it will also fit just as easily into our own reality today, that's where things can get pretty backwards. So before we attempt to apply the text to our current lives, it's really important for us to consider the context and learn as much as we can about it, especially if there are details in the text that don't make sense to us, that don't seem to fit our frame of reference. We will often find some of the answers and some clarity when we explore more about the culture and the language of the time when the text was written and think about who it was written for, who would have been listening in the moment. Sometimes the context may connect also more closely, not with maybe my immediate cultural context, but with another modern day context that's from a more culturally similar setting. And to help us explore this, I spent some time talking about the first parable of Matthew 25 with my colleague Elmarie Parker, who serves with Presbyterian World Mission in Lebanon. I recorded our Zoom call and we were blessed with a pretty solid connection, but there were a few glitches, so I've added subtitles in the places where it might be pretty hard to make out what she was saying. Hello, Elmarie. It is so nice to have you joining in this time to get to dig a little bit deeper into the context of the biblical cultures as we're looking at our Matthew 25 Bible study with the YAV virtual class. Thank you so much for your time today to share a little bit about
what you've been learning and what your reflections are about one of the parables that we're going to be studying here. But first, just to let everyone who's watching know, Elmarie Parker is one of our regional liaisons in Presbyterian World Mission, and she's recently arrived back at her home in Lebanon since the pandemic caught her visiting her folks in Oregon. So glad that you're finally able to be back and settling in to your usual home base in Lebanon with your husband, and grateful for your time today. Would you like to let us know a little bit more about what it is that you do?
Sure. First, Sarah, thank you for the invitation, and hello to all of the Yavs. Grateful that you all have a chance to continue on in this very strange year, which means a very different experience for you all as you're pursuing a young adult volunteer opportunity. As Sarah mentioned, I'm based in Beirut, Lebanon, along with my husband, Scott, and we have the privilege of serving alongside of our partners here in Lebanon and also in Iraq and Syria. So this past year has been a very challenging year here for not only reasons of the pandemic, but also a lot of protest movements that have been led by young adults, mostly in both Lebanon and Iraq. And so we just actually celebrated the 1-year remembrance of the start of those protests here in Lebanon over the weekend on October 17th. So it's a continuing push forward, and grateful for the young adults here that have that vision for the future of this country.
Yes, that's wonderful to hear about that commitment. And we'll be watching to see what develops from their efforts.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I'm trying to lift up intentionally in this Bible study about Matthew 25, and the Yavs have heard a little bit about the PCUSA's Matthew 25 initiative and mandate. But as we dig into the Bible study, we've looked at the whole overview of the Gospel of Matthew as a whole, trying to get a sense of the vision and images there of what Jesus is about and how Matthew is presenting that. But also wanting to remember that we don't always know what the cultural context is, and we have to unpack some of our own assumptions based on our own location, and then try and immerse ourselves and learn more about what the people who were initially reading or hearing this gospel and who Jesus was initially talking to would have had in mind as they're hearing these stories, which can sometimes be strange and have references that don't make a lot of sense from our own immediate cultural context and experience. That kinds of situations that would have been really common for Jesus' experience. So the parable that we're talking about today is from the start of the 25th chapter of Matthew, and the parable of the 10 young bridesmaids, as it is titled in the Common English Bible, which I'd just like to take a moment and read the parable for us here to make sure we are all talking about the same thing. So let's listen to these words. And it says that Jesus is speaking and says, "At that time, the kingdom of heaven will be like 10 young bridesmaids who took their lamps and went out to meet the groom. Now 5 of them were wise, and the other 5 were foolish. The foolish ones took their lamps but didn't bring oil for them. But the wise ones took their lamps and also brought containers of oil. When the groom was late in coming, they all became drowsy and went to sleep. But at midnight there was a cry, 'Look, the groom! Come out to meet him!' Then all those bridesmaids got up and prepared their lamps. But the foolish bridesmaids said to the wise ones, 'Give us some of your oil because our lamps have gone out.' But the wise bridesmaids replied, 'No, because if we share with you, there won't be enough for our lamps and yours. We have a better idea. You go to those who sell oil and buy some for yourselves.' But while they were gone to buy oil, the groom came. Those who were ready went with him into the wedding. Then the door was shut. Later the other bridesmaids came and said, 'Lord, Lord, open the door for us.' But he replied, I tell you the truth, I don't know you. Therefore keep alert, because you don't know the day or the hour. And these are words that I've always found a little bit confusing and perplexing. And I'm curious, Elmarie, what your experience of them has been, and what you may have learned from your experience in your time in Lebanon and elsewhere.
I appreciate the question, Sarah, because I hear this parable differently now, having it here in, which of course is just a bit north from Israel, Palestine, where Jesus would have been teaching this particular parable. And so there's two different experiences that come to mind with this parable. The first is shortly after we arrived here, we found ourselves in our salon, our living room, and hearing all of this noise, drums and guitars. And we're like, what's going on? And so we go out on our balcony, which looks out over this little valley, and the house below our apartment building had this large group of people beginning to gather. And we realized that this was the ensemble that comes to the bride's home in anticipation of arriving to escort the bride to the church for the wedding service. And it was just fascinating to kind of perch on our balcony and watch this unfold. And it probably unfolded over the course of about 3 hours, 4 hours. And more people came, and they're all waiting and gathering. And some people were going into the house to help the bride prepare, but mostly they were gathered outside and just celebrating, playing this music and dancing and all of this. And then this long line of cars approached the house, kind of winding their way up the hill. And they park, and it's the groom and all of the groom's attendants and family that have come. And they get out and they go in, little service that they do inside the house. And then that whole party plus the bride's whole party comes out. There's more cars that have been prepared, covered in flowers, just really beautiful. And so the whole procession sets off up the hill to where the church is located, and horns are honking, and it's a big community celebration where everyone's invited to join in, even though it's a particular party that's going to the church. But that made it a very visual thing for me of what it's like in the context here for weddings even today. And this type of procession is very common in the Christian communities here. And you will see people regularly in these long parades of cars from the bride's house to wherever the church is located. And so just that recognition that still to this day, even though it's obviously done in a different way than at the time that Jesus was walking among us, there's still that sense of the community waiting and the importance of being ready, because they didn't know exactly when the groom was going to show up. And it's a reversal of the bride and the groom, but nonetheless, they had to be ready. And the other one is a little bit more personal experience, where as we began working with our partners here, one of our partners said to me, okay, we'll meet tomorrow. Now I'm coming out of my American mindset where, you have a specific time that you plan to meet and you get ready for that. And I'm wired to be a person that I'm going to things as I possibly can before I start getting ready to walk out the door. So I get ready to walk out the door right before I'm supposed to walk out the door. So our colleague shows up and says, okay, I'm ready. We're going. I said I would, pass by sometime in the morning. And I am not ready because I didn't start my day being ready for her to come at whatever time she was going to pass by. I was still in my mindset where she was going to call and give me a specific time, and then I would get ready. No, that is not how it worked. So both of those experiences brought this parable to mind, and that being, one of the ways that this parable has been understood, that sense of needing to be prepared, to be ready.
Yeah, I think that idea of being ready and not being able to plan exactly is one of the things that, at least when I have Yavs here in person in Colombia, is definitely one of the learnings.
Yes.
And one of the struggles is to adapt to that way of being where the plans will change and the time will change, and you won't know exactly when something's actually going to start, or what might shift in the agenda that was initially envisioned for tomorrow. But being willing to be adaptable to that. And I think being willing to be led by our partners without being in control and without knowing exactly what to expect is one of the really beautiful but really hard things about the experience of coming and being welcomed into this kind of ministry context.
Yes, very much so. Grateful for those lessons and patience on the part of partners. Give me 5 minutes.
Absolutely. And being willing to be granted that kind of flexibility ourselves when we need it too.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, thanks so much for sharing that perspective on the text. I don't know if there's anything else that you think might be useful advice or insight for Yavs who are engaged in this virtual year and working on studying more about this biblical text, or thinking about being in service with partners who might be from a different culture from our own. If there's any tips or words of advice you have.
I think the piece that's so meaningful for both Scott and for me being here is a recognition that probably the heartbeat of our initial call to come and serve here was an invitation to come and be discipled by our partners, to really be able to learn from them what it looks like to follow Jesus in the midst of a context where there's all kinds of conflict and polarization for a different set of reasons than we're seeing that in a US context right now. And we wanted to be able to learn from them. And that's been our tremendous privilege and the gift that we've received. And so whoever you have the opportunity to serve with in this year, and whatever that shape that context of 19, I would just encourage you to be sponges, allow yourself the grace to be discipled by those that you're serving with. Learn from them, learn what following Jesus looks like through their eyes and experience.
Amen to that. Thank you so much, Elmarie, for your insights and for your time. Blessings to you and Scott, and to all of the partners that you're working with, to the people of Lebanon and Syria and Iraq. And yeah, look forward to the next time that we get to connect.
Yes, thank you. Likewise. Have a great rest of your day.